What you're about to experience is one man's quest to see beyond the tumultuous period we're in and to envision what lies just beyond our grasp, yet well within our reach. Welcome to Larry Rifkin's America Trends, where the future has arrived, and it's just in time.
I'm Larry Rifkin here. Welcome again to AmericaTrendsPodcast.com. John Krofzik and I are of a mind to really speak our minds today.
Yes, we are.
We are planning, John, to go for it and test our First Amendment protections right to the limit, John. Are you ready to do that?
Right to the limit. Okay, well, take it to the limit.
Take it. There's a song. It's in everything. So if you are comfortable coming to this podcast channel because it's not the Howard Stern show, all bets are off today, John. I mean, you may wonder, John, what's come over me?
Yeah, what are you, going crazy?
Well, we're going to be not talking about bodily functions and sex bits for the next hour.
Well,
we would never do that, John.
Thank goodness.
I know. I didn't know if you had anything to contribute to any of that.
No.
In truth, I'm just really falling in love, John. I really am.
Oh, boy.
With the American system of protections for speech. And that's what we're doing right now in this podcast. And that's the point. There's virtually no point of entry for podcasts. Just about anybody can do one, and anyone can say just about anything they want. But you and I try to be terribly responsible whenever we get behind a microphone. We really do.
We do, yes. But, I mean, you're right. I mean, it protects good speech as well as bad speech, and that's what makes this country different from other countries.
Even the other traditions of Western Europe are very different than ours. And the thing that really distinguishes the United States truly is the First Amendment.
Yes.
And, John, I was shocked to be reading again in a great book that we're going to be featuring today called The Soul of the First Amendment, Floyd Abrams, that there was really a dispute by our founders, by the states. They really didn't want to amend the Constitution. Had they not amended the Constitution, we wouldn't have the Bill of Rights. We wouldn't have any of this. Isn't that remarkable?
Right. That is remarkable. But it's amazing. It amazes me to this day how that they could get so many people. I mean, you look at what goes on today. Back then, I imagine how it must have been trying to get everybody to agree on this Constitution. I mean,
well, think
incredible.
about it. I mean, when you and I kind of bang our heads against the wall and say, how did I forget this? Look they forgot the 10 most important parts of the Constitution. How did we do that? We're going to have to go back. I forgot, like when I forget milk at the grocery store.
Right.
But they forgot some major things. And I would argue, I guess, really thinking about what Floyd Abrams will be bringing to our podcast today, that there's nothing, literally nothing in our tradition more important than the First Amendment.
Well, I just hate what I hear on college campuses and stuff these days. They want to outlaw hate speech, they call it. But, I mean, that's supposed to be protected under our First Amendment. I mean, people have the right to say things.
Well, you know what's really interesting, John? I mean, in a sense, you're absolutely right about hate speech and about fake news and about just about anything we can imagine. It all is fair game in America. And we've got antidotes to it. I mean, we really do, other than writing laws. And don't forget, a lot of people are saying, well, Donald Trump is going to be the guy who takes away press freedom. Well, he hasn't yet. And John Adams passed the Sedition Act. We've had presidents, and TR has tried to do it with Mr. Pulitzer. I mean, we have had many attempts to restrict freedom of the press, freedom of speech. And I'm not saying that this president wouldn't like to do it, and I think it's corrosive what he's saying about the press. But with that all, what you were just talking about on college campuses, you're absolutely right. But that's not protected speech. You see, I can say to you as an individual, look, I run this company, and at this company, you cannot talk about your pay. We don't want you sharing what you're making versus what John's making. And that's legal. You can do that. I can set up my own rules. But the First Amendment is really talking about our relationship in terms of speech that's protected in reaction to what the government might attempt to do to restrict it. So really, in a way, I think a lot of us think the First Amendment is broader than it is.
Yeah,
but it's all about our
it was.
protections. No. I mean, you can set up your own rules. For example, let's look at the most interesting thing going on today. Aside from hate speech on campus, and by the way, Floyd Abrams would say there's two ways to deal with not liking a speaker. So you bring in, well, remember Skokie, Illinois years ago?
Right.
And it was the KKK or the Nazis wanted to march?
I think the KKK was marching, yeah.
And people hated that. We all hate that. But the way you react is, number one, to respond with rational arguments against that which they are going to be espousing. Or, you can protest peaceably. You can protest. We have measures. We have ways that we can deal with these noxious forms of speech, but it's not to shut it down.
Right.
It's never to shut it down.
We shouldn't shut it down. You're
right.
absolutely right.
But let me just read.
That's a slippery slope there once you start.
Let me read the First Amendment.
Okay.
It's only 45 words. Do you have time?
Yeah, I do.
Or am I boring you?
No, not at all. This is very interesting.
Okay. Well, Congress shall make no law respecting establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or the press. Now think about those words, John, because that's really the essence of what Floyd Abrams has spent his entire life trying to protect, or abridging the freedom of speech or the press. Right. That's it.
Right.
Now,
right,
it goes on, or the right of people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. That's it. That's all they wrote.
Yep. But you notice that the only thing in the Constitution that they do protect a couple of times is the press. The press is very important.
Oh, well, we're written in here.
Yeah,
or abridging the freedom of speech or the press. And that is remarkable. And that's why when Donald Trump talks about the press and they're the enemy and so forth, wait a minute, let's back off here. Now, what has the press become? See, I don't like the fact that the press has become a safe zone. In other words, I'll only go over here because this echoes my sentiments. I don't want to hear what the guy on the other side of the argument has to say. And we have got to deal with that as a mature nation. We can't all retreat to our comfortable forms of expression. We've got to listen to people who disagree with us, and we've got to challenge those or challenge our own thinking in that process.
Absolutely. But I think the other problem with the press these days is the national press falls under entertainment. So it's got to be entertaining so more people watch it. So I think this is why we get caught, too, with some of these programs that say that they're journalists and they're nothing more than talking heads, really.
But, again, I think Floyd Abrams, I'm trying to think the way he does, because in a sense he's an absolutist when it comes to free speech. And he's saying, well, you figure that out, John. John, you worry about that.
I turn him off.
Right. Well, you're discerning enough to do that. He also bemoans the fact that we don't really teach civics any longer. So how can kids be going to Berkeley or to Ivy League institutions and want to railroad somebody off the campus because they anticipate feeling uncomfortable? They want to go into a safe space and not hear someone. I mean, that is not what academic freedom is all about. I've got to tell you, years ago, John, I worked at the State Department of Education in our state, and I was the press spokesman for the Commissioner of Education for a couple of years. And this was during the Reagan years. Now, admittedly, I'm a very moderate guy, moderate to more liberal, perhaps. But what happened was everyone was getting so nervous that Ronald Reagan is going to be taking away free speech. He is going to be eclipsing all of the constitutional prerogatives that we have. And our commissioner, who was a very bright guy, he actually hired somebody to become the assistant to the commissioner, as I was, for academic freedom. And I love the guy that he hired. No, I loved him. He was a great guy, and he was a really smart guy who came out of a really good college and everything. But I was sitting there going, what are we so nervous about? We have got constitutional protections here. It's not all going away because Ronald Reagan is president. And I just thought it was a little bit of overreach. And I think both sides sides are overreaching in many of these arguments. But I've got to say this, John, having been on the air for, well, roughly 40 years of my life, maybe even longer than that, what a responsibility it is whenever we get behind this microphone or we've got a pad in hand and we're trying to write down some ideas to make certain that we can communicate. I mean, that is a powerful responsibility. And if you're saying that you don't think a lot of people now take it seriously and that they're here to entertain us, well, we've got to be able to figure out who those jokers are and who the people who have something substantive to tell us. Last night I was listening to a speaker at an event that my daughter ran in Boston, and she was saying that her website is a little bit different because she actually comes out of a journalism background. Okay. She checks for facts.
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah, and she said all these other websites that are in the same space she's in, that she will never tag them on Facebook or what have you. She'll never retweet some of the things because she goes and looks into what it is they're offering her, and it's nonsense.
Yes, that's a big problem.
But in America, you're allowed to put forward nonsense. And it doesn't have to be parody. It doesn't have to be, something that is just meant to be jocular. I mean, look at fake news. Yeah, what would you say when you think about it with speech? What protections are there for fake news? Somebody's coming out and they're literally knowingly telling us something false. Are there any protections?
On either side, no. I don't think so, no.
Well, number one, I think our biggest protection is having a mind of our own that can look at this stuff.
That's the only thing we can do.
Yeah. And for others to expose that this comes without fact. But there is something that we do have in law, and that is libel. We do have the ability to go and sue somebody for something that is, false, but false knowingly. Right. That's the difference. I might say something on the air, and maybe I have over the years that was not true, but I didn't do it with malice or forethought or intent to mislead. Or did
Absolutely.
I? Or did I, John?
Probably just a bad source.
Or a bad day.
You got to watch those sources.
Or maybe I ate a bad taco and I went on the air. I know. Well, I got to tell you, what an honor it is, John, for you and I to have Floyd Abrams available to us. Now, this is the guy who argued against the government in the famous, probably the most famous case in the recent era, that being the Pentagon Papers case. And he won. Wow. And we saw those released, and that was just a hallmark for free speech against the government. And then, of course, this is going to surprise a lot of people listening to America Trends podcast. But he also is the person who just argued at the Supreme Court in the Citizens United case. Now, many will think of Floyd as an absolutist when it comes to free speech, so they assume that he's going to be there for all liberal causes. But no. He doesn't care if it's liberal or conservative. It's about speech. And he argued in favor of that ruling, and he'll explain that to us today.
Wow, that's something.
Oh, he's amazing. The book is called The Soul of the First Amendment, Floyd Abrams.
Well, let's get him on.
Oh, a remarkable man. Floyd Abrams, I've got to start off by asking you about the First Amendment and making certain that we all understand the protections available to us in the First Amendment and how far-reaching they are.
Right. Well, two things. First, they're more far-reaching than any place else, any other country, any other democratic country at any time, which is to say that what the framers gave us, as the Supreme Court has come to interpret it through the years, is a regime in which the government, federal government, state government, president, governor, whoever, is greatly limited, as is Congress and state legislatures, in doing almost anything which limits freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of religion, and does so in a way which is very controversial in the world. I mean, most of the democratic world, I'm not talking about Russia now or Venezuela, England, Canada, great countries that care about free speech, nonetheless outweigh it in a way that we just don't do it. So So President Trump, when he was running, made some, very controversial statement about Muslims, Mexicans, and the like. That would be criminal throughout Western Europe. I mean, that would
truly
be
criminal.
Hate speech. Yes, it would be considered hate speech to characterize a whole group of people in such a disparaging way. Here it was his articulation of his views on public policy. Obviously, lots of people didn't agree with it, but the one thing no one said was he ought to go to jail or he ought to have to pay a fine or he shouldn't be allowed to run because of that. And in Europe, in democratic countries, people who have used similar language, in England and Belgium, there have been cases where people had placards saying too much Islamization, Britain for the British, language like that. That was held to be a violation of law and of the criminal law. And it's just one example of the many different sorts of situations in which we provide enormously more legal protection for speech.
When we think about speech, it's in relation to the government. Congress shall make no law respecting, abridging the freedom of speech or of the press. I mean, that seems like a rather thin reed for us to go on, that's all we have, and yet that is the greatest protection available to any free people in the world.
It's true, and the argument that occurred back in the 18th century was, why did we need anything? Whoever said Congress could bar freedom of speech? Why do we have to have a list? Alexander Hamilton was saying, well, why do we have to start listing things Congress and the government can't do? We're going to forget some things anyway if we start making a list, he said, and no one ever said they could do it. Why do we have to phrase this, think of it, etc., also negatively? And it was Jefferson, really, more than anyone, who sort of led the battle on a sort of higher ground. Jefferson kept saying, I'm astonished to believe that we're going to give the newly organized federal government all this power and not say that there are things they can't do. And that, Jefferson wrote, that is what free people, any free people, are entitled to.
It is remarkable when you do read in your book, just to remind us, that the founders and the states were, as you say, either inimical to the idea of a First Amendment or at least indifferent to it. What was it that really compelled them? Was it the arguments that Jefferson made? Was it the fact that there had been no tradition of kings and deities and the like that ever gave these rights to people? What was it that finally compelled them to give us a Bill of Rights?
Well, one way to say it is politics, not in the way one uses the word politics just to damn things, but politics in the sense that, we'd had a revolution. Our side won, the English lost, but we wound up with 13 states who were working together but had no single government holding them together. There was no army of the United States. There was no United States. There was no president. There were 13 allied states that had succeeded in the Revolutionary War. And so when they finally sat down years after the war was over and decided, well, let's make a government out of this, a central government. Mm-hmm. There was great concern about that central government having too much power. And so the argument was not that some people saying free speech is important and some people saying it's not important. The argument was, what is the point of writing it down? Why do we need to have it in writing? Why does it have to be added on? We're really just very, very fortunate that the ultimate result was that we wound up with the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, all phrased, or just about all phrased, very, very negatively. No law doing this, no law doing that. And it's really stood us in very good stead through the years.
A lot of people misinterpret the First Amendment. If I'm in a workplace and the boss sends out a memo and says you can't talk about your salary versus someone else, and I know they're trying to change laws related to that, but there is a lot of right that people have to say, no, you can't do this in this workplace. I control this dynamic, as opposed to having a redress against the government.
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, someone with a radio program can get fired for seeming too liberal or conservative, or simply because the boss, the network, has a different orientation, political, social, what else?
Yeah, absolutely.
The government steps in certain areas, like to avoid discrimination, for example. But when you're talking about the content of speech, that as a general matter is something the government can't get involved in, and if he or she wanted to, your employer could.
Why is it, because of the importance that we're placing on the First Amendment, that you said in your book, The Soul of the First Amendment, and it's a wonderful book, and I really do recommend it, that the First Amendment, in effect, was almost invisible in our republic until 1965? That wouldn't make a lot of sense to many.
No, and it's very hard to explain. I mean, we had no litigation to speak of throughout the 19th century at all, and we only started to really have First Amendment litigation around the time of World War I, 1917, 18, when the war was on, and socialists in particular opposed the war, and some of them were sent to jail because of their speeches. And so for the first time, the courts had to address the very difficult legal questions of, it really could hurt recruitment if you tell people that's a bad war. On the other hand, we do have freedom of speech. And that's when the courts started struggling with the issues which still consume us today.
I was thinking that it was because you became the prominent lawyer that you are.
Well, that's the real reason, but I don't like to say
I know,
that.
Absolutely. But to tell us about your role in the Pentagon Papers case, and then I do want to talk about Citizens United.
Right. Well, I was 35 years old then, and it was just a few years ago, and I came to be involved. My law firm represented NBC then, and we were working on cases involving the protection of confidential sources for journalists. And in the course of working on that, I gave a lunch for media lawyers and people who represented media companies. And I introduced to them a professor of mine from Yale Law School who was the one leading our drafting of a brief supporting protection for sources. By purest chance, it was the day after the New York Times started publishing the Pentagon Papers, which was a secret study of how we became involved in the war in Vietnam, prepared during the war, for the Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara. And I was asked, and Professor Bickel, my colleague, was asked by people, what do you think about these new papers the New York Times is publishing? And I've always thought that people who speak the most freely are lawyers who don't have clients. So we said, well, this is America. Come on. The government's not going to go to court, we said, wrongly. And if they do, you'd win. We didn't know that the New York Times had lawyers. We knew they had lawyers. We didn't know the lawyers were telling them they would lose, that they'd lose their television licenses, that the publisher would go to jail, and that they shouldn't publish it. And that night, the Times got a telegram from the Attorney General of the United States, John Mitchell, ordering, requesting that they cease publication of the Pentagon Papers as they became known, and telling them if they didn't, the government would go to court. Well, they decided not to, and here my professor and I had seemed so sure at lunch that everything would be okay, and the firm that had represented them for 60 years refused to represent them because their senior partner was very active in Republican politics, and President Nixon had asked them not to take the case, that we came to do the case. And that's how I really, became involved on a sort of a big-time basis in First Amendment litigation.
Is national security generally the cover that is used when, in fact, somebody's trying to abridge freedom of speech in the First Amendment?
Well, yes, it's the most persuasive basis for limiting speech, in part because, of course, there are some secrets. I mean, there really are some things which ought not to be published, and because courts tend to defer to the government in deciding what they are. But it is usually, and that's not just in the U.S., usually around the world, that's what governments say when they clamp down and prevent publications from having their say.
How did we do after 9/11 with some of the protections we put in place, including the Patriot Act?
I think looking back on it, I think we may have gone too far in certain respects, providing the FBI with sort of sweeping powers to do certain investigations to the point that anyone they went to couldn't tell anyone else, not even their lawyers sometimes, that they'd gotten a subpoena from the FBI. But for myself, I find it, hard to be critical. The 9/11 was not just a shock, but a terrible potential risk for the future. And it's, things had to be done. And I think as it turned out, Congress did go farther than it had to, and later backed up a little bit.
Should there have been another Floyd Abrams coming into his prime who would have taken on cases against the government at that time?
Well, there were some cases. They didn't become great cases. They didn't go to the Supreme Court because lower courts, basically affirmed, as a generality, basically affirmed the ability of the government to take very strong steps to prevent acts of terrorism. That's the way it was viewed in any event.
I would look at you as an absolutist when it comes to free speech, and that means that you may find yourself on the side of liberals often, but at other times they may find that certain things that you fight for are regrettable, like the Citizens United case. Explain what happened there, or your absolutist approach to free speech.
Well, first, I don't consider myself really an absolutist. I mean, I believe that, there's a place for libel law and a place for privacy law and a place for some limits on national security, on the basis of national security, but with very wide boundaries in favor of freedom of speech. So in some really extraordinary types of cases, I think it's perfectly rational and constitutional for there to be some limits. Citizens United is, as everyone knows, very controversial case. I represented Senator Mitch McConnell in it. My view was and is that the very facts of that case indicate the need for legal protection. I mean, here's a conservative political group making a documentary blasting Hillary Clinton when it looked as if she would be the Democratic nominee for president in 2008. Of course, then Senator Obama was later nominated, but she looked like the leading candidate. And here's this conservative group. They did an hour-long documentary. They were partially funded by corporations. And the law, as it then was that if they put this on television within 60 days of an election, that would be a crime. or 30 days of a primary. Mm-hmm. That would be a crime. My view was that here we were talking about political speech of the greatest importance, who ought to be president, and that to say that they couldn't do that, or they couldn't do that without great risk, had to violate at least the First Amendment that I thought we had. Obviously, a very significant body of people would say, well, it's not really speech, it's money, not speech. But my view is that they're so intertwined in situations like this, you couldn't make this documentary without spending the money on people to do the photography and buying the machines and getting the places and running around the country, et cetera, et cetera. That my view was and is that while there can be required disclosure of whose money it is, and while the government, if the people decide, could themselves fund elections, that the notion of having a sort of flat no or no above a certain amount of money and therefore speech seemed to me to violate the First Amendment, and that's why and how I got involved in that case.
Well, I think it's interesting because you suggest that Congress has other ways, aside from abridging First Amendment rights, where they can control bigness, they can control excessive differences in income inequality. Explain that.
Well, yeah, I mean, Congress can limit the size of corporations. Congress can say we don't have any corporations if they wanted to. I mean, there's no First Amendment right to be organized in a corporate form or something like that. Congress can have very tough tax policies. I mean, the opposite of the direction we're going in now. Can raise the tax rates enormously on very wealthy people and on corporations. With lots of money, all those things, none of those things touch the First Amendment. But what does is when Congress starts getting involved with content, in effect, or the amount of speech, and it was sort of the amount of speech that I think was what was at issue here in Citizens United. You can spend X amount, but not X plus 2 amount. And my view was and is that that's not a power that the government ought to have, or that the First Amendment allows it to have.
You worry about the Europeanization of the United States in terms of issues of speech, and of course the French and their right to be forgotten. Can you explain that principle and the worry that you have that there are some who are going to be trying to move us in that direction?
Yes. Throughout Europe now, there has been adopted what is, as you rightly say, called the right to be forgotten. And the right to be forgotten means that under the law as it exists throughout Western Europe, if Google or one of its competitors carries information about a person, about events that occurred pretty far back, not clear how far, but pretty far back in the past, and they have no current relevance, that the person can say, I don't want that on Google, take it down. And that's the way it's enforced. Over 500,000 news articles, I mean, duly published, not libelous, perfectly lawful when they were published, news articles have had to be taken down, not carried by Google, because they were deemed to be not relevant anymore and, embarrassing or off-putting to someone now. They had a case last year in Belgium, a person who drove a car recklessly, leading to the death of 2 people some years ago. A private person, not someone in the government, asked Google to take his name out of the article because 15 years had passed. Google said no. They lost in court. Basically, what the court said is it's a long time ago, and it's not relevant to anything now going on that this person was the reckless driver of the car. Now, I mean, here I'm confident we would say we don't kill history. We don't prevent people from telling the truth. We wouldn't think of saying to Google here, you can't print that or carry it. But that is the law, and now the big question is, can that be enforced here? If they move against Google in France, as has occurred, for example, and get a court order saying that can't be carried by the Google entity in France, can they also say to them, and you better take it down in the U.S. also?
I mean, in America, we don't delete history, but there are other worries that, number one, we're trying to restrict what people can say about where they are, what their beliefs are, what our history tells us. We're also concerned, of course, about people making up news. You tell us that we do have remedies to a lot of these things, and rather than shutting down speech on college campuses, we can address it in different ways.
Yeah, I mean, you know, my view is that college campuses, maybe in particular, maybe most of all, it's important not to shut down speech, even if it's offensive or outrageous, and even if it's sometimes painful. I remember the First Amendment only applies to the government, so it only really applies to state colleges or universities, not private.
So
ones.
at Berkeley versus something that would happen at a private college.
That's right. Berkeley is bound by the First Amendment. Princeton is not. But almost all the colleges and universities that are private say that we follow First Amendment norms, that we choose to follow First Amendment norms. And yet, you know, we have a lot of situations now to the point that I think it's really dangerous from a free speech perspective. People being shouted down on campus, invitations having to be withdrawn because students or sometimes faculty and students object to this speaker or that speaker. And I think it's a very serious problem. And yes, we saw it at Berkeley. I saw it. I'm speaking from New York now. Brooklyn College here also had a situation where Fordham University here. The college Republicans invited Ann Coulter to speak, and the position articulated by the university basically was, well, fine, she can appear on a panel. Well, it's not the same. And you know, my view is that if you have a university where you basically allow students to do inviting of people who they think they'll agree with or learn from, that, you know, the basic rule ought to be let them do the inviting. And if you want to protest, you should protest.
That's in the First Amendment, the right of people peaceably to assemble or to have a more persuasive argument, even against hate speech. Is it harder at a time like this, when we are polarized as a society, to really envelop free speech and really honor it and dignify it, rather than we were all collectively more in the middle, because now there's so much polarization? Is this a time when we really have to stand up for the First Amendment?
Yes, I agree with you. I mean, I think it's more needed now that we're more divided, because, among other reasons, it will divide us further if we start saying, you know, you can't have that speaker, that person's really wrong, really outrageous, or this or that. And it just seems to me that we really have to start down new paths of allowing speech to occur and take it from there. I also think we have to start teaching about free speech and the Bill of Rights broadly, you know, at the junior high school level. I mean, I think it's almost unfair to college students who've never taken a course in or had reference to the Constitution or the Bill of Rights to start condemning them because they say this is a bad person saying outrageous things that are going to hurt feelings on campus, because too often no one's ever told them.
Absolutely.
That's not our system.
I know our time with you is coming to a close. I just want to ask about one thing, freedom of information laws. We're in a state that has trusted that we were one of the first in the nation to really develop freedom of information, and yet we're seeing all kinds of challenges to it, the office being politicized, starved in terms of resources, people finding it more difficult to get information from the government. Do you see that going on across the country?
I see it sporadically. I can't say it's across the country because states have such different freedom of information laws and such different attitudes to them. I mean, generally, state governments don't like Freedom of Information Act. You wind up embarrassing people. Why should we do that? But it is a problem. Now again, we're talking now not about the First Amendment. Mm-hmm. You know, one of the great speeches about the First Amendment was Justice Potter Stewart of the U.S. Supreme Court, where he said the First Amendment is not a Freedom of Information Act, nor is it an Official Secrets Act. It doesn't require the government to produce material, and it doesn't punish you when you reveal information the government didn't give you on purpose. But, and this is now me and not Justice Stewart, of course it's perfectly constitutional to take the step of having a state have a Freedom of Information Act and the federal government have a Freedom of Information Act. And, if we have them, we ought to live with them and live by them.
Well, you are the embodiment of the soul of the First Amendment. Floyd Abrams, I can't thank you enough for being with us today on America Trends Podcast.
Thank you so much for calling. It's really good to talk to you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
You too.
If you like this episode, please leave us a kind rating or review. I'm on my hands and knees. Please do it on iTunes because your review is really critical for us to continue providing this podcast. And John, I know that iTunes looks at this. They want to make certain that we have some rankings, some visibility, and that we're getting some traffic, and then they give you better positioning.
Absolutely. And this way it'll put us in the forefront so you can find us much easier on your iPhone or Android, whatever you may be using.
And they may even send you out an alert. So please, if you can, don't miss a single episode of America Trends Podcast. And, John, they can subscribe on iTunes or Stitcher.com.
And also subscribe on our website.
Oh, absolutely.
We send out a little blurb, and we can also take your emails there at newsletter@rifkinradio.com. That's another way to get us.
And we do not sell or share our lists.
No spamming, nothing.
Well, I don't know. Does anybody want our lists? I don't know, but we don't do it.
Good question.
Even if they asked us.
Nobody's
asked us.
But right.
And when you do subscribe, let us know on Facebook and Twitter. We're getting very active on Facebook and Twitter. Our handle on both platforms, and John, this is really easy, @Trends Podcast. That's it.
That's real easy.
You like that? Did you get that?
I got that.
Okay.
I'm going to have to check it out now. I'm going to have to twit it.
We want to thank you, of course, personally for subscribing. And we also would like to get some of your ideas and questions for future episodes of America Trends Podcast. And that's important, too, because we're all over the map. Our interest editorially in the future, John, has no bounds. But we want to know what it is that you'd like to hear from us. If there was a segment that you'd like to see us follow up on, or if there's something in depth that you'd like us to deal with, please let us know that, too.
We're looking at the future. There's so much we can look at.
Yeah, and the topics that we've dealt with, I mean, we have gotten such incredible guests over the recent period, but they're only going to come to us if they know we've got an engaged and interactive audience.
Absolutely.
So it's really important that you become part of this podcast in so many different ways that we're sharing with you today.
You're absolutely right. We need your support and your help and your reviews.
And your ideas.
And ideas.
Or questions on Facebook and Twitter. And by the way, you can direct message us @Trends Podcast or using the hashtag Trends Podcast. You can also add an email address if you have a public one that you'd like us to give out.
Yeah, good. Hey, and you know what? We didn't mention Amazon.
Oh, yes. We have an Amazon store.
Yes.
And so if you go up, you don't have to buy the things that might be highlighted at that particular time. You can buy any book, and there's some benefit that comes back
Just
to
put
us.
what you're looking at in the little search engine block there, and it'll take you right to Amazon, and it'll help us out.
Absolutely. And it doesn't really cost you anything more because they have built that into their pricing structure. So we get a little taste and you get more programming like this and you get the item that you were looking for. So it works for all of us.
It's a win-win.
Absolutely. Win-win-win.
Win-win-win.
So for more information on America Trends and for the latest updates on upcoming episodes, be sure to like our page on Facebook and follow us on Twitter. You can find us at Trends Podcast. And again, you can find John and I here in our studio performing as best we can for you.
That's right.
And
Let us
making
out.
certain- What's that?
Let
They're
us
not going to
out.
let us out. No one is. Hey, listen, thank you so much for joining us today on America Trends. We'll see you next time.
We hope to hear from you soon.
Oh, by the way, we are posting all the time. And we're posting on Tuesdays and Thursdays.
Good point.
So just be aware, if you're looking for new episodes, they're coming on Tuesdays and Thursdays. When you wake up, before you go out on your jog or your walk and you want to take us with you, we'll be there for you.
Very good.
All right. Have a great day.